Good afternoon and welcome. I open our hearing today dated for Energy and Environment, dated January 26, 2023 at 1:01. And today we're looking forward to a good conversation regarding grid security. This is, of course, something that many of us has heard online, on the news and such. And so I thought this would be a great opportunity for folks to present some information to us. So with that, I'm going to open up. Ooh, like when I hit that though. The construction site. I didn't do that. Yeah,
I'll do it again. Maybe it'll stop.
No. Open up an informational meeting and invite our speakers up. So we have Scott Aronson. Some of them might be, some of them online?
Right here.
SA looks like there's an Aronson.
Yep, Scott is on Teams.
He's online.
Okay. So, yep.
Ashley's on Teams.
So we'll go ahead and we'll have Scott Aronson coming before us on Teams. Excellent. Thank you.
Hey there, Chair Solomon. So would you like me to begin?
That would be wonderful. Thank you so much. Just for the record, state your name and yes.
Terrific. Happy to do it and appreciate the opportunity to be with you today. So my name is Scott Aronson. I am the Senior Vice President for Security and Preparedness at the Edison Electric Institute. EEI represents all of the nation's investor-owned electric companies, including some in Oregon, PacifiCorp, and Portland General Electric. What I wanted to do was talk to you a little bit about the uptick in physical security incidents, but talk about critical infrastructure protection in maybe a slightly broader light to kind of give you a foundation of how best to think about this growing threat and what we collaboratively, both electric companies and state and federal government partners, can do to enhance the security of the grid. So I guess what I'll start with is we are critical infrastructure, and that's not just a fun label that we like to put on things. We are critical to national security. We are critical to the life, health, and safety of the communities that we're privileged to serve. And so to that end, we have a responsibility to be operational through all hazards. Again, today we're talking about physical security, but we deal with storms and wildfires all too often. We deal with cyber and physical threats. We deal with the pandemic and the need to be to maintain business continuity through those challenging times. It really doesn't matter what is impacting the grid. We have an obligation to serve and an obligation to be resilient, responsive, and able to recover through all hazards. So one of my colleagues from the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, Ashley Slater, is going to testify in a little bit. She'll talk in more detail about the partnership that has grown up between the electric power sector, all the segments, not just the investor owns, but also cooperatives, municipals, independent power generators, our Canadian partners. It is a North American grid after all. And the Sector Coordinating Council, which brings senior executives, CEOs from all across the sector together with government partners to prepare for and respond to all of those threats that I just mentioned. But that is a really important component of any defense strategy. We are really good at operating the grid. We are really good at protecting our infrastructure, but we don't have intelligence gathering capability. We don't have a standing army. We don't have some of the things the government can bring to the table to help us defend this critical infrastructure. And by kind of the counter to that is government is really good at some of those things, but doesn't have grid operational expertise. And so together we can be that much more successful in the preparation, defense of, and response to all of these threats. So incidents happen all the time. I ran through all of these hazards, but I think it's important to say from a physical security standpoint, none of this is new. You all are familiar with, whether it's vandalism or copper theft or hunters who had a good day or hunters who had a bad day or kids who are taking pot shots at this infrastructure. It's everywhere. And so by definition, it is a soft target. It is out there in the communities, in rural areas, in urban areas, in suburban areas. It is ubiquitous. And so therefore, it is a target. Because it is a target, or because it is ubiquitous, it also has some superpowers. It is able to be very redundant. There is a lot of resilience inherent in the system. And so I think it's important to recognize that just putting guns, guards, and gates around every piece of critical infrastructure is not a reasonable approach to how to defend it. Some of what we have to do is what's known as defense in depth. That is, there is not a single point of failure. And to the extent that there is something that is a single point of failure, then that is an asset that needs to be better protected, highly prioritized. And that's the way that the electric power sector looks at this. It's not about defending everything from everything all of the time. It is about identifying truly critical assets. It is about protecting those accordingly. And then it is also about being able to respond and recover when something does happen. So I like to talk about, let me say one other thing. I said before that there has been a material uptick in incidents affecting the grid. So while the vandals and the copper thieves and cyber criminals and storms and fires are all absolutely impacting the grid, we have seen an objective uptick in the number of physical security incidents. And so that's why you're having this hearing today. And that's what I want to talk about. So let's, given that uptick, that doesn't mean that we throw out every foundational security practice that we have and start over, but it does mean that we need to work collaboratively, states and electric companies and our federal partners, states and federal partners, to understand why there's an uptick and what we can do about it. So let me talk a little bit about the foundational level of security that we already have, and maybe that will be a good jumping off point for a discussion on some things that the electric power sector is doing and that we could be doing collaboratively to improve the security posture of the sector. As I mentioned, partnerships are a big part of it. And again, Ms. Slater is going to talk in a little bit more detail about the electric power sector's really unique partnership with government. Another aspect of partnership, though, that I want to lean into is the notion of deterrence. So how do we stop this from happening in the first place? That's something that I think increasingly we are seeing. Any incident affecting critical infrastructure should never be considered just vandalism. Even if it is just vandalism, we need to be prosecuting people to the full extent of the law. And in cases where the full extent of the law is not sufficient, we need to change the laws to increase penalties. I think deterrence, to show that an attack on critical infrastructure has downstream impacts. This isn't vandalism. This isn't something that is just going to affect one facility. It could potentially impact the ability for people downstream to receive electricity, and that can have impact on the health and safety of entire communities. So we have to treat it accordingly. Second is partnerships with law enforcement. I think everybody would be familiar with the Metcalf substation shooting in Northern California almost exactly 10 years ago. After that incident, the electric power sector redoubled its efforts to get to know law enforcement at the federal, state, and local level. Individual companies are always going to have good relationships with their law enforcement partners, but how can we really help the law enforcement community and first responders understand that when they are reacting to or responding to an incident at a substation or at a control center or at a critical facility, that they know what they are getting into and that they understand that this is serious. It is not just vandalism. And then the last part of the partnership is we talk about unity of effort, that is industry and government working collaboratively to defend this infrastructure. But what about unity of message? Helping the community understand whether it's see something, say something, or whether it is, this is your infrastructure. The electric companies own and operate it, but this has impact on your community, on your house, on your safety, and really getting more eyes and ears out there to understand that this infrastructure that is out in your community is critical for a reason, and that we ought to be protecting it collectively. So partnerships are a huge part of what we do, and deterrence is something that I think, in particular, state governments can really lean into to make sure that incidents like this are prosecuted the way they need to be. Now, so I talked about three legs of the stool. So the three legs of the stool for security, the first is that partnership I just talked about. The second are standards and regulations. And I think it surprises people to hear a representative of the electric power sector say that they support standards and regulations. We are a highly regulated industry. We acknowledge that because we have one big machine, the energy grid of North America, we have to be responsible to each other all across the sector. And that responsibility entails having operational standards, having CIP standards, critical infrastructure protection standards. And in fact, after the Metcalf substation shooting, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation developed standards known as CIP 14 for physical security. And those are standards that are the law of the land right now and apply to bulk electric system transmission level energy assets. Those standards are exceedingly helpful in ensuring that every company is living up to a baseline level of security, of physical security in particular, of critical assets on their system. And that isn't enough. And here's why I say that. If I mandate, or if we mandate, that all electric companies must put a 10-foot fence around everything, the adversary just brings a 12-foot ladder. Now, that I want to make the adversary bring that 12-foot ladder. I don't want to make it easy for them, but I also don't want any of you to believe that standards and regulations are the only answer to how we defend these assets. We need to have a baseline level of security, but we cannot pretend that regulations and standards equate to security. Security is not a check the box exercise. All right, I've done X, Y, and Z, I'm secure. No, you have telegraphed your defenses and now you're complacent. So I want that baseline level of security, but we need to go beyond that. And so what do we mean by going beyond that? And that's the third leg of the stool. So just to recap, partnerships, critical. Standards and regulations absolutely are a part of a good security profile. And then last is the ability to respond and recover when something happens. If you go back to the beginning of my testimony, I said we have an uptick in incidents and that our infrastructure is the definition of a soft target. It is everywhere. It is easy to see. It is easy to compromise. So with that, you need defense in depth. That is no single points of failure. For where there are single points of failure, added levels of security, and an acknowledgement that I may lose assets, critical substations, control centers, other facilities, my supply chain. Can I operate through that, through those incidents? That's where response, recovery, redundancy, and resiliency, or ours, just to keep it real simple, where all of that comes in. If we think about what happened in Moore County, North Carolina, that was an incident that took out 2 substations and 45,000 customers for 3.5 days. It's a bad day for the operator. That is a bad day for the community. But I would also suggest that recovering that substation in 3.5 days, the fact that it was 45,000 people, not 45 million, and that the company, in this case, Duke Energy, was able to use spare equipment from other facilities nearby, repair that substation quickly, and get the power back on within 3.5 days is actually an example of why redundancy and resiliency is so important to our security posture as a sector. So the last thing I'll say is talking about defense in depth and response, recovery, resiliency, redundancy, talking about partnerships, talking about the standards and regulations that we as a sector must abide by. We also are seeing this uptick in incidents. And so I don't want to be Pollyannish that we've got this all under control. I do think that there is a role for state and federal government and the industry to work collaboratively to increase deterrence, to increase the penalties on these adversaries, to signal that this is not something that we as a society are going to allow, and to continue to reassess what is a critical facility. If something right now has been considered green and maybe it needs to be considered yellow, if something right now is yellow and needs to be considered red, I think that's something that companies are each considering on their own as they look at their own systems, as they look at their own risk profile, as they look at their own risk tolerance. And I think that's something that needs to happen regularly. Electric companies continually assess the criticality of certain facilities. One of my favorite stories is there was an asset that was on a critical list at one point, and then it was removed. And a regulator asked, well, why is this no longer critical? And the answer was because another substation had been built that was now redundant to that one. So it was no longer as critical. Our grid is constantly evolving. Our risk profile is constantly evolving. The threat environment is constantly evolving. And so we must evolve with it too. So with that, I really appreciate the time today. Look forward to any questions that you may have, and appreciate you giving this really important issue the time and consideration it deserves.
Thank you so much, Mr. Aronson. I really want to reiterate with folks that if Mr. Aronson, he probably said this at the beginning, is the Senior Vice President of Security and Preparedness for Edison Electric Institute. I just really kind of wanted to put an exclamation point behind that, because we are grateful for you being here today to share that very strong message and really kick us off for this meeting. Does anyone have any questions for Mr. Aronson?
Madam Chair, I'm assuming we're going to hear more on cybersecurity in the grid as well today, yes?
I believe we will, I'm not certain if cybersecurity specifics, but let's follow along, and then whatever.
Grid software.
Yeah, right. And whatever we need to have for follow-up, we can certainly do that as well in making sure. But I just wanted to say that, Mr. Aronson, you being online, which I think is a gift to have this ability to have this connection, but you have not been here for the disruption that we were feeling with the construction down below as our feet were all vibrating and everything, which caused us a lot of anxiety. But I think it ties in very well with what you're saying, is because when people's service is disrupted and the unknown, it causes a lot of anxiety. So the purpose of having you all here today is to provide that information so that people know there are people that have eyes on this prize, and there is work that is being done, and we can address some of this anxiety or alleviate some of that through information. So again, thank you so much for being here today. And
That was really cool.
the next, I'm going to ask Devin Streed and to come up from the Senior Director of Security and Information Protection for Pacific Power. And then as well as Eric Barnhart will then follow, Senior Director of Enterprise Security for Portland General Electric. So thank you both for being here, and please.
Thank you, Chair Solomon, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Devin Streed, and I'm the Senior Director of Security and Information Protection at Pacific Power. And at Pacific Power, it's our priority to ensure the safe, reliable operation of our system, to continue to serve all of our customers, and ensure the safety of our personnel, particularly our field crews, who, by the nature of their job, are often the first ones to encounter risks, hazards, and security incidents. Even prior to the recent increase in damaging attacks to substations across the nation, we've had robust protective measures and upgrades that prevent detect, and effectively respond to security incidents. Security threats are nothing new. And alongside those protective measures, we also have programs to ensure that those protections are properly maintained, that they remain functional, and that they are appropriate for the threat environment. As new threats and trends emerge and the security environment changes, we need to be flexible and adapt to those changes as well. We follow several regulatory frameworks to protect our assets, but beyond that, we also apply industry best practices based on real-world incident trends and incorporate security awareness into our company's culture. In addition to protective security measures, we offer a variety of security-themed trainings, workshops, and other activities to equip our personnel with the knowledge of how to avoid a dangerous situation, how to leave a dangerous situation, and how to properly report a dangerous situation. We also have proactive engagement with law enforcement and first responders at all levels, including local, state, and federal agencies. And this engagement includes establishing predetermined incident response and coordination and communication protocols. So when an incident occurs, the responders and our personnel are prepared to coordinate with each other effectively. Providing information to ensure the safety of the first responders when they approach and enter a potentially hazardous environment. Supporting law enforcement evidence collection and investigations. Hosting site visits, training for responders, and familiarization discussions. And maintaining those relationships through frequent and ongoing outreach so we aren't just prepared, but we remain prepared to respond when something happens. Finally, we're actively engaged with a variety of industry security-themed organizations, security-focused organizations, government agencies, and intelligence sources, and maintain lines of communication with our industry peers, including those in the room here today, to exchange threat information, lessons learned, and best practices. We take this issue very seriously, and I thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about it.
Thank you. Chair Solomon, members of the committee, thank you for your time today. For the record, my name is Eric Barnhart, and I'm the Senior Director of Enterprise Security for PGE. I want to thank Scott for his overview, and it may seem somewhat redundant, I guess, to coin a term that he used, because I'm going to be echoing many of the things that he sees from a national level that we're seeing here in our service territory. A little bit of background about how PGE is approaching this problem set today. In October of 2021, we combined our physical and cyber security into one. We recognize that the line is blurred between cyber and physical assets, the greater interconnectivity. It's able for us to have a more holistic approach to new threats, be more agile in it, and not be stovepiped. About that same time, we started developing what we've determined is the best approach, and we've taken a risk-based tiering project to each of our assets. As Scott alluded to, all of our assets are important. They're not all the same criticality. So identifying which ones are most critical, which ones we have redundancy, which ones we have resiliency. We can't defend equally across every front. And so we're in the process of taking that tiering process to all of our assets, and then we're undergoing a multi-year program to hardening those assets. But again, as Scott alluded to, we can't harden enough. We have to always be thinking about redundancy and resiliency. And just as he cited the one asset that came off the list, that's the same way we're thinking about it. So we're talking to all our engineers, everybody, all the smart people in our company and around the country of how they're achieving that resiliency and redundancy. I'd also like to touch on something that Scott talked about, is that concept of defense in depth. I sometimes laugh at it, sometimes people remember the Maginot Line from pre-World War II days, and it's you can't defend across that front, and you have to be prepared for when something goes wrong, and how fast can you respond, detect, respond, recover. So that, I think, is part of really driving our conversation around these things. Scott talked about the excellent law enforcement partnerships that we have, and we have them, the good news story in our territory, and I think in the broader Northwest, at the federal, state, and local level. Myself and my team are in weekly, if not daily, contact with the FBI, Homeland Security, all the various state and local police departments. The information sharing is exceptional. Law enforcement has a lot on their plate, but they know how critical this sector is to us. EEI also an incredible partner, and one thing that Scott didn't touch upon but is proven invaluable to us is they have a peer review program where we can ask to be peer reviewed by other people around the country. Other industry professionals can review us, and the exchange of ideas continues with challenges and best practices, and we found that to be invaluable and them to be an invaluable partner. So in closing, I'd like to reiterate what has already been said. Protecting our customers, our people, our infrastructure, and again, delivering for our customers is top of mind for me. It's my greatest priority, and again, amongst the greatest priorities of the company. So thank you for your time today.
Yeah, thank you so much for both of you being here today. Do we have any questions, these gentlemen? No. I just want to say, I really appreciate you both being here, and I think it's very important for our public to be able to know and see that, that our infrastructure and that is protected, is being monitored and continuing to look at that in modern, like different threats, at different levels of threats and the partnerships. So I just want to say I really appreciate your time today. And with that, we will move to the next panel.
Thank you.
Go to Ted Case. And then I think Ted will then introduce Ashley.
That's right.
After that. Yeah.
Well, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Chair Solomon, members of the committee, for the record, my name is Ted Case. I'm the executive director of the Oregon Rural Electric Cooperative Association. ORECA represents 18 electric co-ops that serve 500,000 Oregonians with clean, renewable hydropower in some of the most rural and remote parts of the state. Again, thanks for holding this hearing today on a very important topic. I'm just going to make some general comments today that may be a little bit redundant from the perspective of Oregon's consumer-owned utilities, and there's 36 consumer-owned utilities in the state. Of course, grid security is not a new issue for any of the utilities participating today, but as the chair noted, it has become top of mind recently with the recent attacks that have been widely reported in the media. Unfortunately, Oregon's electric co-ops have experienced sabotage over the past few years, including an attack in eastern Oregon that caused significant damage to a substation. In an era of supply chain challenges for all utilities, the frequency of these attacks are indeed troubling. As you heard today, there is an emerging debate about increasing penalties for those who perpetrate attacks against utility infrastructure. Because protecting the lives of the public and our employees is our top priority, we believe this is a worthy discussion. Regardless, our partnerships with law enforcement are exceedingly important as we remain vigilant against these kind of attacks. It is also important to note that Oregon's consumer-owned utilities are deeply involved in conversations about grid security in a way that fits their specific risk assessment. In the interest of operational security, we do not share the measures we have in place or are considering to increase the security of our facilities. However, I can assure you these conversations are taking place and cost-benefit analysis are taking place at the highest level. Yet these are very distinct conversations depending on the utility. We have an adage in the electric co-op program that says, if you've met one co-op, you've met one co-op. In other words, every utility is different. Senator Finley has numerous rural electric co-ops in his massive district, include the sprawling Harney Electric Co-op that serves some of the most remote parts of this great state. But we also have Salem Electric, which just serves the edges of this downtown Salem here. They're both co-ops. They have the same governance structure, but they look vastly different. And we believe that pursuing a one-size-fits-all approach to address these incidents may be counterproductive. And while it may be impossible or cost prohibitive to harden every piece of our infrastructure, as you've heard, it is important to recognize utilities take protective measures to have sufficient redundancy to avoid prolonged outages that can impact the health and safety of the public. That's probably a good segue to my introduction of another one of your key witnesses today. That's Ashley Slater, who is the Vice President of Regulatory Affairs for the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, a place that I used to work, where I know there's very smart people working on these issues for America's 900 electric co-ops. So she's going to provide a foundation on how this issue looks from the national co-op perspective, but I will say there's not very much daylight at all between her and Scott Aronson, who you heard from with the investor-owned utilities, as well as our counterparts from the American Public Power Association. So I'll turn it over to Ashley and thank the chair and the committee for the opportunity.
Thank you. Please take it away. Ashley.
Good afternoon, Chairman Solomon, Vice Chair Finley, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to testify at today's hearing on grid security. Like Ted said, my name is Ashley Slater. I am the Vice President of Regulatory Affairs for the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association. NRCA is the national trade association representing 900 electric cooperatives. And actually, at this point, I might have you advance to the next slide, please. And I would like to turn your attention to the infographic on the right. America's electric cooperatives, importantly, are owned by the people that they serve and comprise a unique sector of the electric industry. Again, the infographic provides a good sense of our expansive cooperative service territory. We power 1 in 8 Americans and serve as engines of economic development for 42 million Americans across 56% of the nation's landscape. So you can look at that map. It's pretty expansive, and our co-op service territory in Oregon is pretty expansive as well. One thing to note is that cooperatives operate at cost and without a profit incentive. So anytime you all are thinking about legislation or regulation, we always like to point out that cooperatives operate at cost and without a profit incentives. Our members include 63 generation and transmission cooperatives, think wholesale, and 831 distribution cooperatives, think retail, load serving. And this includes ORECA's 18 electric cooperatives that serve nearly 500,000 Oregonians. I'd once again like to thank the committee for holding this hearing today on a very important and timely topic. As Ted Case pointed out, protecting the nation's electric power grid and ensuring an affordable, reliable, and secure supply of electricity are top priorities for electric cooperatives. Before jumping to the next slide, I'd like to highlight the strong industry partnership when it comes to preparing for and responding to national level disasters or threats to critical infrastructure. Scott Aronson with EEI and our public power counterpart at the American Public Power Association, APPA, we work in lockstep with government partners to develop actions and strategies that help protect the North American energy grid and prevent a spectrum of threats from disrupting electricity service. Next slide, please. So what everyone before me has alluded to, I mean, we are here in response, I believe, to the recent substation attacks that happened over the holidays. In December of 2022, and this was alluded to previously, 2 Duke Energy substations were damaged by firearms in North Carolina, causing about 45,000 customers to lose power. Attacks on 4 substations in Washington state left more than 10,000 customers without power on Christmas Day. And now I'm going to get into a little bit of the regulatory framework and the federal response to those attacks. So following those 2 attacks that I just mentioned on the substations and other energy infrastructure, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission directed the North American Electric Reliability Corporation to assess the physical security landscape and provide recommendations for necessary adjustments to physical security and grid reliability standards. I want to point out to the committee that this report is due in April. And so as we're all sitting here today, I wanted to note that there is activity taking place at the federal level to look at the current physical security reliability standards and have a report out to the public in April. Next slide, please. And as Scott Aronson mentioned, I think while this is not new, a turning point in sort of the federal standards landscape was really back in 2013. Again, Scott alluded to the Metcalfe, California substation attack. It was a 2013 rifle attack on a critical electric power substation in Metcalfe, California. And that really was an inflection point that prompted utilities across the country to say, hey, let's reevaluate and restructure, think about kind of the structure of our physical security programs. And ultimately, it resulted in a new mandatory physical security reliability standard, this critical infrastructure standard, SIP standard 14, for bulk power asset owners. And it was again proposed by the North American Electric Reliability Corporation and approved by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And so I wanted to sort of highlight that because that, again, was a turning point that got us to sort of where we are today with federal mandatory physical security standards and this SIP 14 standard. And I'm going to quote NERC here to give you a sense of what this standard does. It's a mandatory physical security standard that essentially requires utilities to have measures in place on their most critical assets to prevent cascading or uncontrolled outages on the bulk power, the high voltage transmission system, should a physical event take place, and also to have methods in place to defend from such attack. So as Scott said, we have a standard for physical security existing at the federal level. Now, one of the things I'll point out is shortly following the attacks in Washington State, the head of NERC put out a press release, and he made it clear that the attacks in Washington State, as well as the attacks in North Carolina, were on substations that do not rise to the level of criticality that they would be subject to this SIP 14 requirement. That said, both of these events, while unrelated, highlight the need to take another look at physical vulnerabilities on the grid, working in collaboration with industry and our government partners, both federal and state. Next slide, please. So one of the things to be proud of, and I'll tell you, I sit here in Washington, D.C., and I'm sure you guys feel it in Oregon as well. But from a political perspective, there's a lot of divisiveness, right? And one of the bright spots really is this amazing framework and government industry partnership in this kind of security space. And so I'd sort of like to highlight what this slide has on it. And again, it's a really successful framework that I'm proud to partner with my colleagues at EEI and APPA in the sector and the government. There's a CEO-led Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council, and it was set up to serve as the principal liaison between the federal government and the electric power sector, with the mission of coordinating efforts to prepare for and respond to national level disasters or threats to critical infrastructure. Its government counterparts include senior administration officials from the White House, relevant cabinet agencies, federal law enforcement, and national security organizations. It's a really important framework for government and industry to come together at the ready in the event of a national disaster, be it a storm, be it a physical security disaster. But it's a framework that's in place to respond very quickly at the highest levels of government and the highest levels of industry to come together and share information. So just an amazing framework and partnership. The ESCC also serves in an advisory role with the Electricity Information Sharing and Analysis Center, known as the EISAC. I want to point out that the EISAC collects and promptly disseminates threat indicators, analysis, and warnings from a variety of private sector and government resources to assist the electric sector participants in protecting or taking protective action. So that's another really important tool that we have at the federal level to share information. And then I'd also like to point out that industry and government are constantly collaborating on tools and resources. Right now, we're working to collaboratively with EEI, our partners at EEI, APPA, the federal government, on tools and resources to provide utilities with a simple framework for risk management, which is tailored to the electricity industry and its diverse set of assets, operators, and vulnerabilities. So lots going on between government and industry, and it's a very successful framework that should give lawmakers, policymakers some comfort. Even though it's not perfect and the threat landscape is constantly changing, we do have a very robust framework at the federal level to partner on these really important issues. And final slide. Let me just finish up by highlighting a few co-op specific priorities, though, but I think across industry, we probably share these priorities. One, and again, Scott Aronson mentioned this, protect the standards development process. Industry experts, we participate in this robust NERC standard setting process. We develop standards for a wide variety of threats and vulnerabilities. These standards are mandatory and they're enforceable once NERC and FERC approve. And we believe that the current process is working. And most importantly, it's adaptable to a security threat landscape that is constantly changing. So protect the standards development process in place for our sector. Number two, we've got to improve the information flow and protection. We want to increase cooperative access to government intelligence information related to a specific threat or a vulnerability that could be timely and actionable for industry. This includes granting security clearances for co-op representatives where it makes sense. So we've got to really improve that information flow and the protection of that information. And then industry action in response to government requests. When the industry acts in response to a federal government request due to an imminent or ongoing national security threat, such good faith action by the utility should receive liability protection. And finally, particularly as co-ops, we want to make a pitch for supporting small and medium entities. And just, I want to go back to what Ted said at the very beginning. If you've met one co-op, you've met one co-op. Each co-op across the country is so different, and one size fits all just doesn't work. So lawmakers and policymakers really need to support efforts, including funding, to develop and expand both cyber and physical security resources and technologies that particularly meet the unique needs of small and medium-sized utilities. So I really want to kind of finish on that note. Let's not be just thinking about, one kind of a utility, one kind of a situation, even amongst our co-ops. It's not one size fits all. So please be thinking about and supporting the needs of small and medium entities. And with that, I yield back. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Thanks again for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us from DC today. Does anyone have any questions for the panelists that we just heard from, Ted Case or Ashley Slater? Yes.
I had a question that would probably be more geared on the Oregon level for Mr. Case.
Okay. I was going to say, otherwise, if it was for teams, we just want to make sure we're mentioning the name so the person can kind of know.
Thank you, Chair Solomon. Thank you, Mr. Case, for presenting on Oregon Rural Electric Cooperative Association. I've had the opportunity to serve some of your rural members in the legislature for the last 4 terms and now on the Senate side. When our chair asked for this preparedness and security, seems like we've covered security really well today in the testimonies, and we've covered preparedness from the aspect of redundancy in the system. I was hoping that we could get a little information on preparedness from what maybe wasn't intended here, or maybe I read it into it incorrectly, but preparedness from the aspect of the user, of the customer. It seems to me like we're doing more and more shutting down for preparedness for that weather event, for that, to prevent wildfire when you have a high wind event coming or something like that. And so the preparedness part of this that I was hoping to hear some more about, maybe you can address, is what are we doing to make sure that your customers, that particularly since I work in healthcare space quite a bit, that your customers that are dependent on some appliance in their homes, that preparedness helps them be prepared for when you have to shut down to mitigate some of these other things, act of God type stuff rather than sabotage type like stuff, but things that you do have some notice that you think we're starting to get. I live in a rural area, sure, and I get notice, hey, we think we might have to shut your power down here in 24, 48 hours. And I appreciate that because I can plan around it, but what if I had a medical device? What is your cooperation doing? Is there any discussions to mitigate that, to identify who those clients are?
Yeah. Chair Solomon, Senator Hayden, thank you for that question. It's a very timely question. As you know, the whole notion of public safety power shutoffs has become more prevalent as wildfire risk has taken place here, and particularly around your district. And so Lane Electric Co-op did do a public safety power shutoff, as you know, earlier this year. And I think one of the things that we have been really focused on with the end user, who you're interested in, is the communication aspect of that. And I think, part of our model is local, and smaller, knowing our customers, knowing their needs. And I know from Lane Electric's perspective, and happy to bring them in and talk to you more about what they're doing specifically, but it's just really, it's preparation and communication and in advance. And I know they have done a lot of outreach. They've done a lot of meetings in the field. You probably can't do enough of that to prepare. I think there's been a little bit of frustration as much as they communicated. There's still confusion at some point about those. Shutting off the power is not an easy decision to make. It's a very serious decision, and it has consequences. So lots going on that on the communication front. We're continuing to refine that, and happy to come in and talk to you more about some of those, some of the details and some of the plans that they have to work on that.
Follow up?
Yeah.
Thank you. So that's a good explanation. I get it, and I understand the communication part, but I want to take that one step further. And you can get back to me, or, this isn't specific for Lane Electric. I happen to live in that area, so I know when those things happen, right? But it's across the state. Who, in your opinion, let's say somebody's on something as simple as a CPAP machine. They need that machine to be functional, and let's say that medical device has either no battery life or an hour battery life, and we're mitigating millions of dollars of potential destruction if a power line starts a wildfire, maybe tens of millions. Who's responsible to identify that end user, as you term them? We call them clients or patients, but who's responsible to identify that end user, but not only identify them, I want to take that one step further. Who's responsible to get them a battery pack that might last for 48 hours? That's what I'm talking, that detail is what I'm talking about. Is that a general fund obligation to the state? If we're mitigating tens of millions of dollars of potential wildfire, it seems like a $500 battery that, if you could hook them up to a 20-volt DeWalt battery, those things work pretty good. They're $800, but where are we in that conversation to make sure that these end users are able to continue to have success with their health care in their homes, even when we have these power shutdowns? Or do we have to just say, no, we can't do that, we need to move them to a different facility? Yeah, Chair Solomon, Senator Hayden, thank you again. Again, it's a new world with these public safety power shutoffs. I think a lot of these questions need to be, explored. I don't know exactly whose the obligation is. I know that, just knowing who's out there and what those needs are, particularly for, our utilities, they want to know who has those medical issues, where the vulnerable people live, what needs do they have. I know you have legislation on this, which we want to come talk to you about, and see what can be done on that. So I know we've had some conversations with, within our electric co-op board about your legislation and about these issues, but happy to come talk to you more about it. Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Further questions there? And thank you. And I just wanted to add my comment to something that Ashley Slater had stated about the importance of this being in unity, because, no pun intended, we're all connected by transmission line. Okay. But anyway, I think we will continue on with our next two presenters, which is Dan Kirschner and Wayne Pipes. I think Wayne is going to join us from Teams, so we'll hear from Dan first, and then we'll go to Wayne Pipes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Members of the committee, my name is Dan Kirschner. I am the Executive Director of the Northwest Gas Association, representing the gas utilities and pipelines that serve Idaho, Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. You see up here a list of our members. You see a schematic of the transmission pipelines that serve our region up here. In Oregon, we own and operate about 30,000 miles of pipeline system to deliver warmth and comfort to about 3 million residents and 850,000 households, and productive energy to about 85,000 businesses, institutions, and industries. So that's the Northwest Gas Association and who we represent. Mr. Aronson was terrific. Ms. Slater was terrific, and the detail you got from the utilities and utility representatives in the region, I could probably stop by saying ditto for a lot of it. I think the thinking behind physical security and safety of these systems is very similar across the gas system and the electric system. Partnerships, standards and regulations, respond, recover, resiliency, all of those things are very similar. The difference really is in the physical attributes of the system. But I did want to give you just if I can move this forward here. Can you help me there, Andrew?
Andrew has the power.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to give you a couple of visuals here, really. I think this applies whether you're operating an electric system or a gas system, how we think about safety and security of the system. And it's a continuous loop, right? It doesn't start anywhere, it doesn't end anywhere, it's going all around. But if I were to pick a starting place on this graphic, I would say it starts with management commitment. It starts with really a culture of safety and security, wanting to protect the people who are served by the system, protect the people who work on the system, and protect the energy that's delivered by that system. So it's a culture. It's even deeper than a culture. I mean, we could call it a value. Safety is a value. Security is a value. It's more than that, really. It's part of the DNA of our industry. So it starts there, and I would say the management commitment, what I think of is it goes beyond management commitment, right? I call it from the CEO suite to the street, right? It has to go all the way from top to bottom. And then you move through the rest of this cycle. Risk management, which you heard a lot about, it's impossible to, when you own and operate 30,000 miles of infrastructure, you can't protect every piece of that. And that's the gas system, which is not as ubiquitous as the electric system. So it's about thinking about where the risks really lie, how to protect those critical risks. I think it was referred to as single points of failure, the potential for single points of failure, right? So that's, if we could go to the next slide, Andrew, please. I just really quickly here, I wanted to drive through some of the differences really in the electric system and the gas system. First of all, electricity travels at the speed of light, or pretty close to it anyway. It moves very fast, and so the entire electrical system operates not at a speed, but at a frequency, right? So a disruption in the system can create outages in the system. The natural gas system is more like your water pipes. Natural gas moves on a high pressure transmission system, moves at about 20 to 25 miles an hour. And in the distribution system, even slower than that because the pressures are lower, right? So interstate and intrastate pipelines, interstate, just like it sounds, those are pipelines that cross state boundaries regulated by FERC. Intrastate are transmission pipelines, again, higher pressure pipelines designed to serve one area of a single state, move gas from one area of a single state to another. So it might be, for instance, it could be a pipeline off of an interstate pipeline to serve a particular facility, an industrial facility or something like that, might be a intrastate pipeline. And then you have distribution pipelines. In Oregon, I mentioned the 30,000 miles of pipeline. About 2,500 of that, 2,500 miles of that is transmission pipeline. The rest is distribution mains and service lines. One of the big differences between the gas system and the electric system is most of the gas system is underground. And it's naturally hardened in that regard. If you think about hardening a target, right, to use that phrase, most of the gas system is underground. There are some above ground facilities. I've listed a couple of them here: valves, sensors, compressor stations, city gates or meter stations where transfer of gas from the interstate pipeline to the utility occurs. And then, of course, meters like those on your home. Most of the above ground facilities that really represent a risk to a broad number of consumers are usually in pretty remote places. That could be good. It also can be a risk. Because, you know, we don't always, if somebody sees something out there, I think Scott mentioned, Aronson's mentioned a hunter with a bad day or a hunter with a good day, right? They're out there in some of these areas. So what are the risks and threats to that system? Well, really, there's two types: cyber. Senator Golden, appreciate your reference to cyber, and physical. And the physical risks really boil down to could be vandalism or acts of terrorism, but it could also be something as mundane and simple as excavation damage. Somebody didn't find out where a pipeline was. They didn't follow the 811 rules of the state and ended up damaging a facility. So the way to mitigate those things is, again, just to repeat some of what Mr. Aronson said, assess and prioritize. We have to understand on the system where the single points of failure could be, where the greatest risk is, if you will, and then we prioritize those accordingly. Harden those areas that we need to. Hardening can take the form of more monitoring or even, you know, guards. I think another phrase I heard was guards, gates, and guns is not the answer in every case, right? But maybe visual surveillance is. But certainly frequent flyovers or even walking patrols around areas where you might have some of these. Educate, certainly. And I want to emphasize something that we've heard all along: the partnerships that are important in ensuring security and safety of all of our energy infrastructure are just a critical nature. Our partnerships with first responders, law enforcement, and the community, letting them know how to understand when something's going wrong, right? And to whom to report if they hear something like that. And then finally, monitoring those facilities. And then I just wanted to close, Andrew, next slide. This is exactly the same visual as I showed you before, just a little different take on it. So again, it's a continuous loop. It starts with a culture of safety and security. It moves to committing to safety and security over the long term. It includes a lot of communication with stakeholders, including consumers and first responders and the like, and continuous improvement. We got to continue to monitor what's going right, what's going wrong. Just because our facilities are underground, we should not take that for granted. We need to keep an eye on these systems, and then finally continuing to assess and mitigate the risks that we are able to identify. So with that, you're going to hear from Wayne Pipes here, I think, who will maybe have some more specific examples of how some of these principles are put to work.
Great, thank you. And then we'll ask for questions.
Sure.
So Wayne Pipes, will you take it away?
Sure. Everybody hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Chair Solomon and members of the committee, for your time today. Really appreciate it. For the record, my name is Wayne Pipes, and I'm the Director of Facilities, Security, and Emergency Management at Northwest Natural. A little background on Northwest Natural. Our company is over 160 years old, which is just a little bit older than the state of Oregon. We serve over 2.5 million people in more than 140 communities in both Oregon and Southwest Washington. Safety is our highest priority, and we have one of the most modern systems in the nation, natural gas systems in the nation. Next slide, please. So I echo a lot of the comments shared by the other presenters. collaboration is key in the utility industry, and we have very good collaboration with our federal partners, as well as with the American Gas Association and other utilities, including utilities in the Portland area. I wanted to share just some of the things that we're working on, and this has been a multi-year project that this has been going on for some time. We didn't just start this year, and one of those is last year we had audits completed, and this speaks to the partnership with the TSA of all of our critical infrastructure locations, which were very helpful and helped us to identify some things that we're doing right and some things where we had some opportunity. We've also completed internal security assessments of all of our facilities and infrastructure throughout our service territories. So we understand what type of physical security apparatus we have and what some of the risks might be, or risk profiles might be at these locations. And then we developed a ranking system. You've heard this, I think, from some of the other presenters. Are there workarounds? Do we have redundancy? What are some of the vulnerabilities? And so we ranked all of our assets so that we knew which ones were the most important and the ones that maybe we had redundancy and weren't as critical. And in that line, we've begun these enhancements. It's a multi-year program. And I agree with all the other presenters, fences and guards are not the only solution, but it's part of it. And so this is something that we're working on as far as enhancing our security. We also have, it's an important topic for us, we have a cross-functional security steering committee that oversees the work that we do, helps us to prioritize the work that we do, and this is made up of all the other key areas of the company. And then lastly, we're continually talking with our employees out in the field. There are eyes and ears in the field. If they see something, say something, and we're continually keeping our operations management team updated on a regular basis. And with that, I'm glad to open it up to any questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Pipes. Does anyone have any questions for either of these panelists? Yes,
I do. I've got a
Senator Lieber.
question. Thank you, both Mr. Kirschner and Mr. Pipes. I'm wondering about when, do you have auto shutoffs? How does that work? No, he went away. Come back.
Well, I hope he's still on the line.
Right. I'm wondering about, you're saying they go 25 miles an hour. Where do you have all your shutoffs, and how does that work if there's some sort of damage that happens so that we don't have gas leaking into the atmosphere?
I understand what you're asking. I honestly don't know how many automatic shutoff valves there are in our system. There's Wayne. He can come back. I will say that this is one of those balancing acts, right? If you have an automatic shutoff valve, that could be reasonably, thoughtfully subject to potential cyber attacks, right? So one advantage of having a manual system is it's not vulnerable to a cyber kind of attack. That said, this is that balancing act, right, where you may want auto shutoff valves in certain places to ensure just what you're saying, that when something happens, you can shut it off with a flip of a switch instead of have to send a service tech out with a wrench to shut the valve down. So Wayne may have some more specifics about how they think about it.
That'd be great.
Yeah, I was just going to add that our gas control team has visibility through our SCADA system of all of our pressures, and they'll know immediately if there's a problem, whether we lose pressure somewhere, and they can pinpoint where that is, and then we dispatch crews to go out and see what the problem is.
SCADA is supervisory control and data acquisition. These are the systems that actually run the big boards that you see if you've gone into a gas or electric control system.
But can I follow up?
Yeah.
So you have to wait during that time. Is the gas is then leaking into the atmosphere potentially because you don't automatically shut it off? You have to actually take the time to have the crew come out. Is that correct?
Yeah, it doesn't happen very often, but when it does, there is some gas that leaks until it gets shut off.
All right. Thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions for this panel? I think I just would, you and I had the pleasure of meeting and talking more at Lehigh when we had that opportunity, which I know that, I'm not sure who else has been through Lehigh. Here, I know Senator Finley, big fan.
Yes.
But I know that I'm trying to go back into my memory banks if this was covered during that course. And if, you know, I think it would be a great resource for us to try to see what type of information they have on this subject as well, to see if maybe we can get them to submit some stuff for the record as well, because I think they're a great organization that can provide that background. Did you have a comment?
Absolutely. We can, whether it's Lehigh or the resources that Lehigh calls on to do some of the curriculum development, I think we can provide some of that information for you for the record.
Yeah, I think that would be great. I think any information, I realize the delicacy of placing too much information that says, hello, here's our playbook. But I think that providing that information to consumers and rests that anxiety to be able for them to know, especially when we were talking, or many of you have been talking about messaging and how I think how we worded it, unity of message, and how that is being put out to folks to, you know, get that information out to them. If you see something, say something, this is what you do, so that they have the power at their fingertips. I think that's a great opportunity as well. And then I also noted, I think, I'd hate to keep going back to Ashley Slater, but I think it was Ashley that mentioned about the report that was due in April. So hopefully we'll kind of just put a pin in that and maybe be able to, when that is released, be able to provide information, you know, that at some point we can put on the record and for committee members to kind of look at that information. So, yeah, please.
I'm sorry, I just have one more question, and it's just a question for the group that actually spoke to us. I would like to understand the interplay between federal law, especially when we're talking about just even sort of federal criminal law, and how the state criminal law interacts with it, because as somebody said, I think here, to maybe an increase in penalties or something that we can do. But I know that there's some federal law jurisdiction and some state law jurisdiction, and I'd love to understand the interplay between the two of them as it relates to this this infrastructure.
Certainly, and not necessary for folks.
No,
you, go.
Your last one. Okay, go. No, but it's just, there's an interplay that I don't think that I have a clarity on.
Yeah, I think that would be great information. Anything that folks that have presented could, get back to the committee so that we can share that. That would be, because I wrote that down as well, and I wasn't sure exactly to the extent of how that would work. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So thank you. Thank you so much. And so that is the extent that we have for the speakers today, which I don't know. I'm very appreciative of everyone's time today, because whether you're en route and driving somewhere and you hear the OPB, talking about this is a frequent conversation point. And I think the public just wants to feel some assuredness. And did you want to make a comment? Oh, you look like you're eager. So, and today I want to say we don't have any youth voice signed up for today, but that is something that we want to normalize as every single meeting, which I'm just going to say it. Probably not cool that I do, but I'm going to say it. There is some committees that somebody had mentioned that were in Idaho that were actually closing down and not offering, they did not want to hear testimony from people under the age of 18 in their committees. And I'm like,
So your approach is slightly different than that.
Hear ye, hear ye. This is a little different. So I think that it is amazing that we are, that we're doing this together. And I've had inquiries just most recently from a 6th grade class, finding out a little bit, trying to find out some information. And then last night I met somebody who said, that his kindergarten-year-old son, what are the, and I said K-12. That is the the direction that we're taking. A little bit
So
of
you're
time
cut
at
off
the
as
end.
kindergartners.
Kindergarten.
Is that your, okay.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure.
My 2-year-old grandson might have plenty to say, but we are going K-12.
Okay.
And it's just a little bit of time at the end of our meeting, and I think they are really worthy voices to hear in this, in the work we do. But with that, I'm going to close the informational meeting, and I just then wanted to add for the good of the order, and I apologize at the beginning. Sometimes I just get in the zone, but Senator Finley was excused today. He really did want to be here. We talked at great length about the preparing for this committee, but he was excused today, and Aaron is filling in for Beth today, so thank you so much for being here, and thank you during the Andrew, you cranked the volume for us and got us to where we could hear everybody's testimony. So with that, I adjourn us for the day.